My sister, Sarah, baked cookies for my daughter's birthday and sent them with a sweet note, "Happy birthday. Eat as many as you like." 3 days later, she called and asked, "Did she eat the cookies?" I laughed and said, "Your kid came over earlier and ate them all." The next thing I heard was her screaming through the phone, "Happy birthday." In the morning, in Newton, an upscale residential area in the Boston suburbs, the day begins quietly. Elizabeth Carter was reviewing real estate contracts spread out on her kitchen island, basking in the morning sunlight streaming through the large windows. Her fingertips were perfectly manicured, and her silk blouse and tailored pants looked as though they had stepped out of a fashion magazine. "Mom, I need to get to school early for the sports festival practice." The sound of 12-year-old Sophie rushing down the stairs echoed throughout the house. Her long blonde hair was tied up high, and despite wearing sportswear, she exuded an air of elegance. "Make sure you eat breakfast, Sophie. Nutrition is especially important before a competition." Elizabeth smiled as she handed her a bowl of granola and yogurt. James had already left for an early morning meeting, leaving mother and daughter to enjoy a peaceful morning together. "Angela's mum saw the house you sold last week. Everyone was impressed," Sophie said. Elizabeth nodded with satisfaction at her daughter's words. "Can you imagine making $10.0 a month just from YouTube? All from home. That's exactly what I did with Reddit stories, no face, no voice. Check the link in the description if you're curious." Her reputation in the Newton district had become unshakable. Her name in the real estate industry was known with the confidence that properties handled by Elizabeth Carter always sell for top dollar. As the mother-daughter conversation continued, Elizabeth's smartphone rang. Looking at the screen, she saw it was her mother, Grace, calling. "Good morning, Elizabeth. How are the preparations for Sophie's birthday coming along? I've ordered a special cake. It's shaped like the trophy she won at the state science competition last year." Elizabeth frowned slightly but responded kindly. "Thank you, Mother, but I've already placed an order with Jackson's Patisserie." "Really? But what I ordered is special. A special child like Sophie needs a special cake. For Rachel's son, Daniel, an ordinary cake was fine." Grace's voice was as decisive as always. As a former high school teacher, she hadn't lost the habit of ranking her students, and that habit extended to her grandchildren as well. "Mother, please don't compare Daniel and Sophie," Elizabeth quietly admonished. "By the way, is Rachel coming to the party?" "Well, I don't know. I called her yesterday, but she said she was busy with work." "It's just a part-time job, isn't it? If she had really put in the effort like you did, she could have found a better job," Grace said. Elizabeth sighed deeply. Her sister, Rachel, had taken a contrasting path in life. She dropped out of college, married young but separated a few years ago, and was now raising her 13-year-old son, Daniel, alone while working as an administrative clerk at a local supermarket. After hanging up, Elizabeth gazed out the kitchen window. Rachel's apartment was about a 30-minute drive away, in an area redeveloped from an old factory district. She had offered financial assistance several times, but Rachel always stubbornly refused. Rachel's pride was so strong that she had once declared she would rather take a second part-time job than accept charity from her sister. "Mum, Angela's mother is here to pick me up." Sophie's voice interrupted Elizabeth's thoughts. Elizabeth quickly kissed her daughter goodbye. "Do your best today. I'm looking forward to your relay race at the sports festival." After Sophie left, Elizabeth tried calling Rachel again. On the third ring, she heard her sister's tired voice. "Rachel, are you really unable to come to Sophie's birthday party?" "I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I couldn't change my shift." Rachel's words trailed off. Elizabeth understood what she wanted to say. At family gatherings, Grace typically praised Sophie while throwing harsh words like, "You could try harder at Daniel, the first to understand, but I'll send something for Sophie." Rachel's voice became slightly harder. "Yes, of course. I'll make something special." After hanging up, Elizabeth remembered the bitterness in Rachel's voice. They had been close sisters when they were young. When had this distance grown between them? After their father's death, Grace's favorite had always been Elizabeth, while Rachel was labeled as the child who needs more effort, and that dynamic had been passed down to the next generation. In the evening, when James returned home, Elizabeth discussed the birthday party plans. Her husband, who ran a knit company, was always busy but made sure to set aside time for his daughter's special day. "Won't Rachel and Daniel be coming?" James frowned. "Sophie has been wanting to see Daniel." Rachel says she has to work. Elizabeth chose her words carefully. It seems Daniel's grades haven't been good lately, and I think she doesn't want him to get another lecture from Mother. James nodded, understandingly. Grace should really be more. He swallowed his words. It was wiser to avoid criticizing his mother-in-law. That night, Elizabeth sat on the living room sofa, flipping through a photo album. As she stared at an old photograph of her and her sister, arm in arm, laughing, she wondered, what if I were in Rachel's position? What if my child was constantly denied and compared? And she couldn't help feeling a small pang of guilt for having turned a blind eye to this situation for years. Elizabeth's spacious dining room was decorated with colorful balloons and a banner reading Happy Birthday. Sophie hung above the table. As catering staff arranged plates of food, Sophie excitedly showed off her new tennis racket to her friends. Everyone, the cake is ready. Elizabeth signaled James to turn down the music. In the living room, more than 10 of Sophie's classmates and neighborhood families had gathered. Grace, dressed formally, had positioned herself next to her granddaughter, boasting to each guest, "My granddaughter won a gold medal at the district swimming competition this year." The doorbell rang, and when Elizabeth answered, a delivery person stood there, a package for Miss Carter. Taking the box, she noticed Rachel's name as the sender. Elizabeth sighed quietly. She had expected Rachel and Daniel wouldn't come, but she couldn't help feeling a twinge of loneliness. Back in the kitchen, Elizabeth opened the box and took out a small basket of homemade cookies and a card, "Happy Birthday. Eat as many as you like." It read in Rachel's handwriting. Elizabeth picked up one cookie and examined it closely. They looked like ordinary chocolate chip cookies, but something about their color seemed unnatural, and they were unevenly baked. When she brought one to her nose, she detected a faint, unpleasant odor mixed with the sweet scent of butter and sugar. "Is that something from Rachel?" Grace's voice came from behind her. She looked at the basket of cookies and sniffed disdainfully. "Well, I guess she couldn't even afford to send a store-bought cake. Homemade is certainly cheaper." "Mother," Elizabeth said warningly, "Rachel is busy. No matter how busy, she could at least attend her niece's birthday. You always show up for Daniel's birthday, no matter how busy you are." Elizabeth sniffed the cookie again and felt uneasy. Sophie has a swimming competition next week. It would be terrible if these made her sick, she thought instinctively. "I'll keep these in the kitchen," Elizabeth said, placing the basket on a high shelf before returning to the party. In front of the cake, Sophie smiled happily, surrounded by her friends. As camera flashes lit up the room, Grace suddenly stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? I'd like to tell you about my wonderful granddaughter." Inwardly annoyed by her mother's words, Elizabeth maintained her smile. Grace began to detail Sophie's recent grades and sporting achievements. Her victory in the science competition was thanks to Elizabeth's parenting approach. "My daughter is truly a wonderful mother," Grace continued. "Perhaps parenting is a talent. I never thought two sisters raised in the same environment could turn out so differently." Elizabeth frowned at her mother's comment. This was a dig at Rachel. She stood up to change the subject, calling out, "Let's cut the cake." After the party ended and the last guest had left, Elizabeth was sipping wine in the kitchen when she called her sister to thank her. "Thank you for the cookies, Rachel." Sophie was thrilled. She lied. In fact, she hadn't even told Sophie about the cookies. "Good. I'm glad." Rachel's voice sounded hollow. "How was Mother?" "The usual," Elizabeth answered honestly, talking about Sophie's grades and sports achievements. Rachel was silent on the other end. Elizabeth tried to keep the conversation going. "How's Daniel? How's school?" "Well, you know, he failed another math test. He's really trying." "But," Rachel's voice was tired. Elizabeth didn't know what to say. How could she justify the unfairness where her daughter was praised for everything, while her nephew was criticized no matter what? "If there's anything I can help with, I'm fine," Rachel said sharply. "I don't need your sympathy." After the call ended, Elizabeth stared at the cookies on the shelf. For some reason, she couldn't bring herself to throw them away. She transferred them to a container and placed it discreetly at the back of the refrigerator. The next day, while Elizabeth was doing paperwork at her real estate office, she received a call from her mother. "Elizabeth, did you hear? Rachel's son failed another math test." There was a hint of pleasure in her mother's voice. Elizabeth knew it satisfied her sense of superiority. "Mother, please stop with this kind of talk. I'm just stating facts. Unlike your Sophie, that boy, enough." Elizabeth rarely raised her voice. Stop comparing Daniel and Sophie. They're just children. On the other end of the phone, Grace seemed surprised. You're being sensitive. I'm sorry, but I have an appointment with a client. Talk to you later. Elizabeth hung up and slumped over her desk. Childhood memories flooded back to her. When Rachel showed their mother a drawing from school. Well, that's nice, but Elizabeth's use of color is better. When Rachel finished a piano recital, you made so many mistakes. Elizabeth's performance was perfect, and she herself had accepted it as natural. She took pride in being her mother's favorite, and sometimes even teased her sister. Don't be jealous of my daughter. As a teenager, Elizabeth had said that to Rachel on the day her college acceptance letter arrived. The hurt expression in Rachel's eyes was still etched in her memory. Now, the same pattern was repeating Sophie and Daniel, the successful one and the unsuccessful one. Elizabeth felt the need to finally confront the distortion in their family that she had been ignoring for years. On her way home, she stopped by the supermarket near Rachel's apartment. It was a time when her sister should have been working, but she wasn't there. Instead, she spotted Daniel bagging groceries at another register. He must be helping his mother after school. Elizabeth kept her distance to avoid being noticed and observed her nephew, thin and tall. Daniel looked so much more mature than one would expect for a child Sophie's age. His tired expression made Elizabeth's heart ache. 3 days later, Elizabeth was reviewing real estate contracts in her home office. Outside the window, autumn rain was falling quietly, and from the living room came the sound of Sophie practicing the piano. As she reached for the coffee on her desk, her smartphone rang. The caller ID showed Rachel's name. Elizabeth frowned. Calls from her sister were rare. She wouldn't call unless it was something important. Hello, Rachel. On the other end, her sister's voice sounded strangely cheerful. Elizabeth, I've got a question for you. What is it? There was a moment's pause, and Elizabeth could hear Rachel's breathing. So, did anyone eat the cookies? Elizabeth glanced at the drawer of her desk. Inside was a photo of Rachel's cookies from the birthday party. That morning, seeing the cookies still hidden at the back of the refrigerator, she had instinctively taken a picture. The misshapen form and poor coloring of the cookies had bothered her. Oh, you mean your cookies? Elizabeth feigned a casual tone. Yes, did Sophie like them? There was a strange tension in Rachel's voice. Elizabeth made an instant decision. She stood up from her chair and walked to the window, changing her tone of voice. Actually, your son came by earlier and ate them all. On the other end of the line, there was a moment of silence. Then Rachel's scream rang out. Daniel, when? What has he done? It was the voice of someone in panic. Elizabeth, maintaining her composure, stared out at the rain. This afternoon, he stopped by after school. He said, Aunt, I'm hungry. So I told him I have cookies that Rachel sent and gave them to him. The lie flowed smoothly from her lips. In reality, Daniel had never visited her house, and no one had eaten the cookies. How many? How many did he eat? Rachel's voice was trembling. All of them. He really seemed to enjoy. Elizabeth deliberately added details. What's wrong? Is there a problem? The sound of Rachel dropping something came through the phone. Her breathing was irregular, as if she was desperately trying to suppress a scream. Rachel, are you okay? No, it's nothing. Rachel was clearly agitated. I just need to talk to Daniel about going places without permission. That's... Elizabeth fell silent. Rachel's words had turned her suspicions into certainty. Something had definitely been mixed into those cookies. Something intended for Sophie to eat, really. But he did seem a bit strange, Elizabeth said, pressing further. After he finished eating, he said, My stomach feels weird. Rachel's scream-like voice came again. Oh my God, I'm coming over right now. The call ended. Elizabeth stared at her smartphone, unable to move for a while. The gravity of what she had just done slowly sank in. She hurried to the living room. Sophie was still sitting at the piano, practicing Chopin's Nocturne. Sophie, may I have a word? Her daughter paused her playing and turned around. What is it? Mom, Aunt Rachel is coming over suddenly. There's a bit of a problem with Daniel. Sophie looked surprised. Daniel? He hasn't been at school lately. I heard he had a cold. Elizabeth gazed at her innocent child's face. Despite being cousins, Sophie and Daniel had little contact. Even at family gatherings, they rarely conversed. I have a favor to ask. When Aunt Rachel arrives, Please let us talk alone. Could you go upstairs and do your homework? Sophie looked puzzled but nodded obediently. Okay, but is Daniel all right? Elizabeth couldn't answer that question. I don't know. That's why we need to talk. After Sophie went upstairs, Elizabeth took the container out of the refrigerator. Inside were 6 cookies, still untouched. She placed them on the dining table and waited. The rain grew stronger, the sound of it hitting the windows, echoing throughout the house. In Elizabeth's mind, memories of her sister surfaced and faded. The backyard, where they played as children. The days they switched clothes and confused their mother. And then the gradual rift. The envy and pain in Rachel's eyes each time Elizabeth was praised. The doorbell rang, and Elizabeth came back to herself. Opening the door, she found Rachel standing there, soaking wet. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear. Daniel, where is he? Is he all right? We need to get him to the hospital. Calm down, Rachel, Elizabeth said gently. Daniel isn't here. Rachel stopped in her tracks. She stared at her sister in confusion. What do you mean? You just said I lied, Elizabeth announced quietly. Daniel didn't come here, and no one ate your cookies. Rachel's expression changed relief, anger, and shame mixed together, and eventually, tears spilled from her eyes. How could you come to the dining room? Elizabeth took her sister's arm and led her to the container on the table. Not a single one of your cookies has been eaten. Rachel looked at the cookies on the table and collapsed into a chair. She covered her face with both hands and shook her shoulders. Rachel, what did you put in these cookies? A long silence followed. Only the sound of rain filled the space between them. Finally, Rachel raised her face and looked at her sister with red, swollen eyes. What was I trying to do? Her voice was thin, as if questioning herself. Tell me, Rachel, Elizabeth gently urged. What's in these cookies? Laxatives, Rachel said with difficulty. Strong laxatives, but just a small amount, not life-threatening, just so that Sophie would, before her important swimming competition. She broke down in tears again. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. What was I thinking? Elizabeth placed her hand on her sister's trembling shoulder. She should have been furious. There was no reason to forgive a sister who had tried to harm her daughter. Yet, strangely, Elizabeth's heart was filled with sadness rather than anger. Why? That was all she asked. Rachel looked up and met her sister's eyes with tear-clouded ones. Her expression held echoes of the hurt little girl from long ago. Our mother praises Sophie and disparages Daniel, just like when we were children, the same pattern, where you were always praised, and I was always criticized. Rachel's voice grew stronger. Every celebration of Sophie's success only highlights Daniel's failures. Just once, I wanted her to experience a setback too. She choked on her words. I wasn't in my right mind. Elizabeth was speechless. She never would have thought that Rachel's years of suffering and resentment would manifest in this way, but she wasn't entirely unable to understand her sister's feelings. I share some responsibility, Elizabeth said quietly. For years, I've turned a blind eye to this issue. I thought mother's ways were natural, and even the treatment Daniel received was somehow just the way things had to be. The two sisters were confronting a truth they had harbored for a long time. On the dining table sat the cookies that no one had touched. Rachel was still covering her face with both hands, her shoulders shaking. I'll make some tea. Elizabeth quietly stood up and went to the kitchen. She mechanically boiled water and prepared 2 mugs. Inside, anger, sadness, and sympathy mingled complexly. How could she forgive a sister who had tried to harm her daughter? Yet, at the same time, she understood the years of pain behind Rachel's actions. After brewing the tea, Elizabeth placed a mug in front of Rachel and quietly asked, "Why did you call?" Rachel raised her tear-stained face. I regretted it from the moment I sent the cookies. I couldn't believe what I had done. Her voice trembled, but I couldn't take it back. So, if no one had eaten them yet, you were going to warn me? Elizabeth asked gently. Rachel gave a small nod, but when you said Daniel had eaten them, I panicked, thinking your plan might create a different victim. Rachel began crying again. What kind of terrible mother am I? I should be protecting Daniel. And yet, Elizabeth took her sister's hand. It was cold and shaking. Rachel, tell me, how is Daniel really? After a long silence, Rachel sighed. He's suffering at school. They call him the epitome of failure, being Sophie's cousin, only adds to his pain. Rachel's voice was bitter. Teachers constantly say, "Your cousin is so excellent," and classmates tease him. At home, mother says, "Why can't you work hard like Sophie?" Elizabeth frowned. "I had no idea it was that bad." "He is trying." Rachel's voice grew stronger. "He studies until late at night, but the results don't show. Since last year, he's been saying he doesn't want to go to school." Elizabeth felt a tightness in her chest. She had never wanted to acknowledge how her daughter's success was directly linked to her nephew's suffering. "And I," Rachel continued, "I should be happy for your success. But I'm jealous, living in a beautiful house with a successful husband and a brilliant daughter, just because my life looks perfect." Elizabeth said quietly, "That's only the surface. James and my relationship is colder than you might think. He's so absorbed in his work that our conversations are mostly about everyday practical matters, and the pressure on Sophie is immeasurable." Rachel looked surprised. "She's always expected to be perfect from mother, too," Elizabeth continued. "Last week, Sophie broke down in tears after getting one question wrong on a math test. She was worried about what Grandma would say." The sisters looked into each other's eyes, each carrying different burdens in their lives. But at the core was the same issue: Grace Carter's distorted love. "Our problems revolve around mother, don't they?" Elizabeth said. Rachel gave a small laugh. It was her first genuine smile. "Yes, always." Elizabeth stood up and took the container from the table. "We don't need these anymore." She walked to the kitchen and threw the cookies in the trash. Rachel watched and said, "How can you forgive what I tried to do?" "Forgiveness may not come immediately," Elizabeth answered honestly, "but I can try to understand. And perhaps it's time we face the disease in our family." "How?" There was despair in Rachel's voice. "First, I'll make an effort to better understand Daniel. I want to help him find his interests and talents. I'll encourage Sophie to interact more with her cousin," Elizabeth said, choosing her words carefully. "And with mother, we need to have a serious conversation about how her evaluations affect the children." Rachel looked anxious. "Do you think mother will listen?" "I don't know," Elizabeth answered honestly. "But change won't happen without trying." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. Sophie appeared, looking slightly awkward. "Sorry, Mum, but I finished my homework." She spotted Rachel and smiled slightly. "Hello, Aunt Rachel." Rachel couldn't hide her agitation. Facing Sophie was particularly difficult after the cookie confession. "Hello, Sophie." She forced a smile. "Happy birthday. Sorry I'm late." Sophie approached. "Thank you. You sent cookies too, right?" Mom mentioned it. Rachel stumbled for words. Elizabeth intervened quickly. "Yes, she did. But unfortunately, they got broken during transport." Sophie looked a bit disappointed but quickly brightened. "That's okay. How's Daniel?" "I haven't seen him at school lately." Rachel looked at her niece in surprise. "Oh, you've been concerned about Daniel?" "Yes. We sometimes meet in the library. He knows a lot about history." Sophie's words were straightforward. "Last week, he helped me with my report." Elizabeth and Rachel exchanged surprised glances. There was a relationship between the cousins that they knew nothing about. "Sophie," Elizabeth said, as if suddenly struck by an idea, "shall we invite Daniel for lunch this Saturday?" Sophie's face lit up. "That would be great. I want to show him my new game, and I'd love to hear more about the old coins he collects." Rachel looked perplexed. "Sophie, you know about Daniel's coin collection?" "Of course," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "His collection is amazing, especially the what-do-you-call-it Morgan dollar," Rachel suggested. "Yes, that's it," Sophie said excitedly. "He really knows his stuff." Elizabeth felt that something was changing in that moment. The fact that Sophie and Daniel had already built their own relationship was unexpected to her, and it was also a ray of hope. "We'll be expecting you on Saturday," Elizabeth said to Rachel. "Let's take a new step forward as a family." There were tears in Rachel's eyes, but this time they were a different kind of tears. The early summer sunlight brightly illuminated Elizabeth's backyard. Smoke rose from the barbecue grill, swaying in the wind, and James and Daniel could be seen side by side, grilling meat on the deck. Sophie was taking photos of blooming roses with her new camera. "Here you go." Rachel handed Elizabeth a glass of lemonade. The sisters sat side by side, admiring the garden scene. Many things had changed since that rainy day 6 months ago. "I'm so glad Daniel's photo exhibition was a success," Elizabeth said with a smile. Rachel nodded. Since joining the photography club at school, he's really come alive. His teacher was amazed, saying, "I had no idea he had such talent." "Everyone needs to find their own path," Elizabeth said. It seems Sophie has become interested in his photography too. The change that began with that Saturday lunch gradually spread throughout the family. Elizabeth noticed Daniel's talent for photography and gave him his first digital camera. Sophie learned new perspectives from her cousin, and Daniel learned study techniques from her. "Don't you think Mother has changed recently?" Rachel said quietly. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "I was surprised when she attended Daniel's photo exhibition and said such touching words." Changing Grace wasn't easy. The night when Elizabeth and Rachel jointly confronted her about how she treated her grandchildren was tense, though Grace initially resisted. As Daniel's talent for photography became evident, her attitude began to change gradually. "We're regaining our balance, aren't we?" Elizabeth said. Rachel squinted at the sun. "Not perfect, though." "There's no such thing as perfect," Elizabeth laughed. "Even my perfect family was an illusion." The sisters had begun to cherish their time together. Once a month, they met for breakfast, just the two of them, to share childhood memories and current worries. Rachel had also found a new job and was becoming more financially stable. On Elizabeth's recommendation, she had started working in the administration office of a local art college. "Mom, look," Sophie approached, showing the screen of her camera. "I took this using the composition Daniel taught me." Elizabeth admired the perfectly composed flower photograph on the screen. "That's wonderful, Sophie. Thank you." "Daniel," Sophie called out toward the garden. Daniel, who had been grilling meat in front of the barbecue, waved shyly. He stood with more confidence than before and smiled more often. "Everyone, dinner is ready," James called, and the whole family began gathering around the table. Elizabeth etched this scene in her heart, not perfect, but a family that had confronted the truth. The cookie incident had brought long-hidden issues to the surface and given them the courage to face them. Perhaps a true family isn't about competing for perfection, but accepting each other's imperfections and supporting one another, Elizabeth thought. Rachel placed her hand on her shoulder, and the two sisters smiled at each other as sisters, as mothers, and above all, as human beings.